Hi, I'm Chris McBrien, a Gen-Xer, and the pop culture from my generation is awesome.
And I'm Yancy Eaton, a Millennial, and the pop culture from my generation is dope.
Episode 27, 80's Sitcoms. Hey, it's Bob Goes Your World. I'm Chris McBrien, along with Yancy. And as always, Yancy, what can I say? Every week we just seem we get better and better. We got a great guest this week, great topic. You ready to go or what?
I am ready. This guest is actually my Twitter dad. I've mentioned this before, Mike,
Yep.
and you've never really embraced me as your Twitter son, officially, which is fine. I understand that, no hard feelings or anything, but Mike was the first person that I actually cared about online that followed me back. It was a big deal. I took a screenshot and sent it to my friends and stuff. Holy crap! Look at this. Mike Gianella followed me, and it sounds like I'm being patronizing. I'm not. I'm being 100%. I have a screenshot of it saved on my desktop whenever Mike followed me.
I agree with you, and I have to say I was the same way when Mike ended up following me back in the day, because Mike's Twitter feed is one of the greatest things ever. I love it. It's great. So it's Mike Gianella is our guest. Mike is, if you don't know, is a fantasy baseball writer for Baseball Prospectus, and where he has been writing since 2013. He actually lives in the suburbs of Philly with his wife, 2 daughters, and 3 cats. And I'll tell you what, his love of fantasy baseball is only surpassed by his love of pop culture, so he is going to fit in very, very good around here. Mike, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for the introduction. I don't know if I can live up to that. Yancy, I'm honored and a little creeped out, but mostly honored. It's funny. I'm probably, the dad thing is probably appropriate because while I do try to keep up, I think the key for me is I have a memory of older pop culture that some people don't have. Even my wife, who's a little bit younger than I am, is how do you remember all this crap? Yeah. And then, so with some newer stuff, I obviously, watch shows and try to keep up, but it's definitely tougher with the 2 kids that you mentioned in the intro and just everything going on in life.
Yancy, Mike might be your Twitter dad, but I think he's my Twitter brother, because I'm the exact same as that. So this one's going to be good. So this week, we're going to be talking about 80 sitcoms. Guys, are you ready to get started?
Yep, let's do it.
Okay, here we go. Back in 1985.
I don't want to give people the wrong idea.
Saved by the Bell, the college years.
My wife knows about this. She's cool with this.
The girl from Dirty Dancing and Ferris Bueller?
I am in love with dank memes.
MC Mike G and DJ Swen.
Black people Twitter.
We're going to ring-a-dong for a holiday.
It's not something you just want to advertise.
Because rapping is my thing, and I do it every day.
As you're singing this, I'm cringing for you.
I pretend that I have my own show on the Food Network. Okay, so this week we're going to do something a little bit different. Normally we go back and forth when we have our guest, and Yancy, you chime in. So Yancy, since you were born in 1988, it might not be fair for you to have to go through your favorite 80s sitcoms, because it might not be appropriate. So if you don't mind, maybe Mike and I will go back and forth, and we're going to get to our top 5 80s sitcoms. We're going to go from 5 to 1 in reverse order to work our way up to number 1. And as we go through our list, maybe Yancy, you could maybe chime in with some questions as a millennial who wasn't around to watch these shows first run. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you what, some of the ones on my list, you probably don't have a friggin' clue what they are. Maybe you can chime in and ask us some questions, and maybe we can flesh them out a little bit for you. Does that sound okay for this week?
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Honestly, the only thing I have to add is that I know The Simpsons started in 1989 at the very tail end of the decade, and I'm very fond of that show, but that's basically all I have for today. So you guys can go ahead, and I'll have you some trivia ready when you guys finish.
No problem. Well, before we get started with them, I did want to say something, because sometimes some people have accused me of being sort of textbook, when I do stuff on this show. For example, I go with the obvious choices, right, when it comes to things, or so I'm told. But this week, I'm telling you what, this is going to change, because I tell you what, if you made a list of all-time popular sitcoms from the 80s, I would say at least 4 of my 5 wouldn't be on most lists. But anyway, that being said, so it's time to get started. Like I said, we're going to do things a little different. We're going to let Mike start off. So Mike, we're going to do your top 5 sitcoms, and you can kick us off with your number 5. What have you got?
Okay, so this is a show that of all the shows I picked, this is probably the one Yancy's least likely to remember, although he might have heard of it.
Right.
And it's a show that took place in the state of Maryland, and the the premise of the show is that there was a governor of Maryland who was kind of not exactly inept, but kind of bumbling, and his housekeeper was the star of the show, and he worked and helped him out. Eventually, got promoted and worked his way up, and that show was Benson.
Yes, it was.
And Robert Guillaume was the star of the show, and part of my love of the show was Guillaume, who was just such a terrific actor. He was later on the brief, short-lived show Sports Night as not a central piece there, but part of the ensemble. And although he was the glue, it was just one of those very funny, reliable sitcoms that there was a laugh in it every week. It was pretty standard for plots. Interesting piece of trivia with that show is that Jerry Seinfeld, who before his show was rarely on television, appeared on that show in a guest spot, pretty much when he was an unknown. I mean, he was doing comedy at that point. It might have been on Carson once or twice, but he just wasn't established at that point. So yeah, Benson for me was kind of a reliable go-to, and I think it was also a show I appreciated more as time went on. Just because now we've had an African American president of the United States, but at the time the show ended with a cliffhanger they never resolved with Benson, Robert Guillaume running for governor. And that idea, like back then on TV, was featured in a show. It was pretty novel, especially a comedy.
So, absolutely. So I think that's a great pick. So Benson, Yancy, you've heard of Benson? You're familiar with the show in any way?
No, honestly, not at all.
Robert Guillaume did do a guest spot on Saved by the Bell of the college years, though, as a professor of ethics. So maybe you remember him from that. I don't know.
Again, no. This is this is going to be a recurring theme on tonight's show. Is you guys talking about stuff with me just sitting here idly. So,
Yancy, how old were you when Saved by the Bell to Collegers was even on?
Probably 5.
5 or 6 years old. Yeah,
something like that. So it's all good. Okay, so guys, are you ready for this? My number 5 is Small Wonder. Okay, it ran from 85 to 89, and it's probably one of the worst sitcoms of all time. So therefore, it's in my books. It's one of my favorites. It made my list. So you know how much I love campy stuff when it comes to pop culture, and let me tell you, it doesn't get much more campy than this show. Okay, Yancy, here's the premise of the show. There's this guy Ted. He's a robotics engineer. Okay, and he develops a robot that he calls a voice input child identikit, or as it shortens to, Vicky. And the robot is this little 10-year-old girl, and he brings her home to live with his family because he's married and they got a son. And of course, hilarity ensues. So, well, sort of. Because the robot, she isn't programmed for any emotion, so she just talks in this monotone voice. She can't express any emotions. But even still, she expresses more emotion and inflection in her voice than the rest of the cast combined. Because the actors that they got to play the leads are some of the worst actors ever to appear in TV. I think, but the best character is probably like the neighbor's kid. Like there's this neighbor's kid, she's got red hair, and she always comes by, and she always thinks something's going on with Vicky. And then there was like a couple other guest appearances, like Lark Voorhees from Saved by the Bell was in it, Brian Austin Green. And then even like well-known names at the time, somewhat well-known, like Marsha Wallace and Jesse the Body Ventura. The show's cheesy. The acting was bad. The sets were bad. The scripts were bad. But needless to say, I loved it. I enjoyed every minute of this show. Yancy, you got to look it up on YouTube. I know you can get episodes on there. Even if you just watch the opening credits, the opening theme, you're going to just think I'm crazy for watching the show. But I loved it, and it's Small Wonder. That's my number 5.
So a couple things about Small Wonder. Yeah, okay, it was a cheesy show. My sister loved it, and you're actually right about the actors. Like the actors were so bad. Really bad. I don't know if you know this or not, but Seth Green auditioned for the part of the son on that show.
Oh, interesting.
This is before Seth Green, had done anything, and was an unknown. And he was really
probably it was probably right around the time that he did Can't Buy Me Love, or just before when he did Can't Buy Me Love.
It was probably just before, based on the Can't Buy Me Love. I think was 87 or 88. Yeah, this was 85, so it was before that. So he was really annoyed, but when he was interviewed afterward, he was like, yeah, it's probably really good I didn't get to do that show because it would have killed my career. And for years they would have looked at me and been like, oh, you're the boy from that stupid show with the robot that was really bad.
Yeah, it was definitely bad. Anyway, so that was my 5. Okay, on to your number 4. Mike, what have you got for us?
Well, I had a couple of tough ones here. Now, this one, it's not exactly a cheat, but I looked it up, because Yancy, you mentioned the Simpsons and how it premiered, in 1989, but that's not an 80s show, and like another show I was looking at was Murphy Brown, but that's really more of a 90s show. It was on 90s. Like for 2 years in the 80s, so I didn't want to cheat, but I did pick a show that was I'd say about 60% in the 80s and and 40% in the 70s, and that's WKRP in Cincinnati.
Yes. Yes. You know how much
that's
I love
a show, and that's a show people Yancy.
It's actually, I'll give it to you, it's a 50-50 because it went from 78 to 82, so it's 50-50.
I looked it up, and it was about 58-60% in the 80s, so it counts. I didn't want to do a cheat here. So great ensemble cast. Just Howard Hessman was in it, Tim Reed, Lonnie Anderson, Gordon Jump. Just one of those shows that had all of these great actors and great performers. Very funny. Another show that was kind of ahead of its time with some pretty edgy storylines and language, and just one of those shows that was, I don't want to call it appointment television, because by the time I watched in syndication. I was a little bit older, but just one of those shows you could rip through and watch almost every episode. There just weren't too many clunkers. It wasn't, when you go back and watch it now, I wouldn't say it's like the greatest show in the world, but it was one of those shows that was consistent from episode to episode.
I agree. I mean, and I think, like, I don't know, I almost, when I think of WKRP, and that's why it's not on my list, actually, surprisingly enough. It's not, because I always think of it as a 70s show, only because those first two seasons were my favorite. Seasons 1 and 2 are my favorite on that show. And so they happened in the 70s, so that's why I kind of go with it. But, Yancy knows how much I love WKRP in Cincinnati.
Well,
it gets a lot of mentions on the show, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it certainly does. It certainly does.
Well, the thing about it is that there's the things people always talk about, and I think these did take place in the 70s. There's the turkey promotion.
Oh, of course.
Which is the thing everybody remembers. But there were two serious episodes that always stick out with me, and that one of them was an episode where the
general admission, the general.
General admission is the one everyone remembers, which is based on a real life event in Cincinnati where people were trampled to death at a Who concert. Yep. And then the second one was an episode where that someone bought the station and he wanted to censor the songs. Yes. And both the DJs were mad about it, and the station manager was well-meaning and well-intended. It's like, well, why shouldn't we promote values? So Howard Hessman's character, Johnny Fever, handed the manager the lyrics to Imagine.
Yes.
And at that point, he realized when he read it to the revenue, said, no, that's a bad song. It doesn't believe in God. He's like, no, he doesn't say it doesn't believe in God. He just says, imagine a world with no God. It's a hopeful song. So, that's the kind of stuff that, shows like that I really enjoy. It's not just the comedy, which, certainly brings you back, but it's the humanity as well.
Oh, I couldn't have said any better myself. And those are two episodes that stick with me as well. That show was fantastic, well written, great characters. Had it all. So that was a great pick. Love it. Okay, my number 4. This is a few steps down from WKRP in Cincinnati, but I tell you what, I loved this show. Okay, it's called It's Your Move, and it only lasted for one season, from 84 to 85. It started out in September 84. Done in May of 85. So a grand total of 18 episodes. That was it. But I tell you what, when I was young, I loved this show. So it was Jason Bateman's first real sort of starring gig on TV. And he went on to be in Valerie, obviously, which, morphed into Valerie's Family and the Hogan Family. But before that, he was on this show, It's Your Move. And so the show is about this teenager that he plays, and he's basically getting into all these crazy situations because he's basically a teenage con artist. And I remember he was trying to sell answers to the school tests, and then I remember one time his older sister has a pajama party and he tries to install bugs to record what they're saying, and then one time he took the school's money to hire a band for the dance, and instead of getting a band, he gets all the skeletons from the biology lab and he rigs them up with strings, and then he plays music and he pretends that they're real, and then they end up getting elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and all this stuff. But most of the plots of the show, though, they focus on him and his neighbors. So basically, Jason Bateman's character, his name's Matthew Burton in the show, and he moves into an apartment with his mom and his sister after their dad passes away. And then the neighbor starts dating his mom, and the neighbor, though, is onto all of his scams, and he's trying to stop him. And it's just a back and forth between them. And the guy that plays that character is David Garrison, who most people remember from Married with Children. He was Steve, the next door neighbor, Steve and Marcy. And like I say, it only lasted one season. It never really found an audience, but I absolutely loved this show. I just think it didn't find the audience. And it's not the first time that a show has been canceled after one season. If you look at something like Freaks and Geeks, for example, only made it through one season. Doesn't mean it's not good. I think It's Your Move was fantastic. A little known show. But it makes my list. Number 4.
And I'm sure, Yancy, you don't remember that one. That's a really good choice, and that's one that people, I'd say around 40, a little bit older, do talk about.
Yeah.
And Bateman had come from Silver Spoons,
right,
where he was a sidekick there, and actually he was probably the best part of that show. And,
well, Alfonso Ribeiro was pretty good.
I mean, he was talented, but I mean, in terms of the comedy,
I agree with you.
Bateman added a little bit of edge to that show, and it wasn't an edgy show; it was a little kid show. But he had a little bit of edge to the show. When he left, like it just clearly kind of like fizzled without him.
I agree. So so you're number 3, Mike. What have you got?
Okay, so my choices are pretty, I don't want to say boring, but they're pretty mainstream. So number 3 for me is a long-running show, and all my shows from this point on are long-running, and it's Night Court.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Night Court's a show that was, you know, part of NBC's like dream Thursday night lineup in the 80s, and you know there are a couple other shows that I actually didn't pick that were part of that lineup for a while, which were The Cosby Show and Family Ties, which were more popular and certainly had some bigger stars at the time. But of the 3 shows, Night Court really has held up as a show that was, you know, kind of edgy. You know, it took place, you know, in a New York City municipal court in the evening. There were, you know, they were always defending like these low-level criminals, but you know, really it was an ensemble piece with, you know, just all these actors. You know, Harry Anderson, you know, John playing, you know, the judge, and John Larroquette playing Dan Fielding, and you know, it was an Emmy, you know, award-winning turn for him. But it was just a great ensemble piece that, you know, went on for years and years, and you know, just very entertaining, you know, and something that I liked about the show too, it avoided the whole romantic, for the most part, like romantic subplot, and there was some chemistry between, you know, Harry and Markie Post and her character, but they just really avoided like getting too wrapped up in that and kind of destroying the show as it went on. So, you know, Night Court was on for 9 seasons, but it started in 1984, so it definitely, you know, kind of fits, you know, mostly in that 80s. Yancy, I don't know if you've watched 30 Rock, but you might remember Night Court from a 30 Rock episode where it was featured prominently.
I've never seen 30 Rock either. That's like one of those shows, just like Parks and Recreation, where all of my friends collectively like just keep pressuring me to watch it, and I've never actually got around to seeing it. There's just too many shows. Like, I'm always like constantly having to pick. You know, I always end up just rewatching The Office for like the 6th time. Yeah,
you should watch 30 Rock. That's if you like Tina Fey and any of her movies, you would like 30 Rock.
Now, Markie Post was one of the her character was, she was like one of the court-appointed lawyers, right? And I remember before she came on the show, remember when Ellen Foley was on and played Billy? So Ellen Foley, do you remember what she did in the 70s?
I do not.
So Ellen Foley, a little bit piece of trivia. You remember who I mean, right? Billy with the short hair, the blonde hair.
Yeah, no, I remember Billy, and she was like the first public defender,
right? And then Markie Post took over.
You could kind of see she didn't really like work out. Like, it was one of those things where, you know, like she was okay, but you just got the vibe from her that, you know, she didn't quite fit the show.
Well, one of the reasons I think for that was because the chemistry wasn't there, because she wasn't an actress by trade. She was a singer. Right. And if you remember Meatloaf's song, Paradise by the Dashboard Light, she provides the female vocals in that song.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then she went into acting, and then she got that gig. And you're right, she didn't quite fit in chemistry wise. So they replaced her with Markie Post, and then things really took off because Markie Post was phenomenal.
Well, and apparently, I'm just remembering this now. You know, Post was they had initially wanted her, and she was under contract for another show from the 80s, The Fall Guy.
Right.
So that was part of the reasoning. They were like, well, you know, they didn't necessarily. They might have kept her, you know, and kind of tried to go along for another season, but like, wow, you know, the person we want is now available, so let's, you know, make the switch.
You know how Markie Post got started in show business? Actually, is in the 70s on the old Richard Dawson Family Feud. She was one of the people that wrote the questions.
I did not know that.
Yeah, just a crazy piece of trivia. I don't know why I know that. It's just another one of those things that I just know. It's just crazy.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Okay, so my number 3, my show, it only ran for 2 seasons. There's a little bit of a common thread here. A lot of my shows aren't, you know, real popular. But it started in the fall of 1980, ran until the spring of 82. Okay, so living in New York is very, very expensive, as I'm sure you know. So there's these 2 young guys that are in the advertising industry. They can't afford the price of rent in the city. So what they do is they find this all-girls apartment complex that has really, really cheap rates. But since it's female only, they have to dress up in drag and pretend to be girls so they can live there. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm talking about Bosom Buddies with Peter Scolari and a very young Tom Hanks. So Yancy, you know Tom Hanks as an Oscar-winning actor and, you know, someone who's widely considered to be probably one of the greatest actors of his generation. But I remember Tom Hanks as a guy that wore dresses and makeup and called himself Buffy. So it was sort of inspired by Some Like It Hot, I think. So the producers of the show were Miller Boyett. They were really popular in the 80s and 90s producing shows. And what they wanted to do was like a male version of Laverne and Shirley. But they kind of used the drag angle as the show in the first season. They went away from it in the second season, more to like a buddy comedy. I think there was a couple reasons why the show never really took off. There was an actor's strike in 1980. Also, the show just got bounced around to a bunch of different time slots. That's always a killer, too.
Did the second season have there was like an advertising agency?
62nd Street, baby. Yep,
yeah,
62nd Street.
I just remember that there was an agency.
They did. And they just never really found an audience. I did like that show a lot when it was on the air. I watched it in syndication, too. I really liked it. I think if nothing else, it gave the world Tom Hanks, right? And the supporting cast was good, too, don't you think?
Was it Thelma or Thelma? It's Thelma. Thelma Hopkins.
Thelma Hopkins.
In that show. Holland Taylor.
Donna Dixon. Wendy Jo Sperber was an 80s staple. She was in Bachelor Party 2, by the way.
I always remember her from, I think it was Back to the Future, too.
Yes, of course. She was the sister.
Well, not the second one, the first one. I said Back to the Future 2, meaning also.
Also, of course. Okay, so speaking of 2, what is your number 2 sitcom of the 80s, Mike?
Well, it's funny because he's more well-known for his first show, both self-titled, but I think his second show is kind of underrated, and that's Newhart.
Oh, that's
so Bob Newhart in the 70s was on a sitcom called The Bob Newhart Show, where he played a psychiatrist, and he's in Chicago. And so in the second one, which was not related to the first one at all, and as a kid I was very confused by this, I understand. He was an author who decided to buy an inn in a New York City author decided to buy an inn in Vermont and run the inn, even though he had no experience running the inn. So the first couple seasons of the show were they weren't serious exactly, but it definitely was a comedy, but they tried to play it straight. But then as the show went on, it got crazier and crazier. There were these great characters who were these hillbilly brothers, Larry, Daryl, and the other brother Daryl. Yep. Tom Poston played the handyman. Speaking of Peter Scolari, he joined the show later as a boyfriend of Stephanie, who was the ditzy housekeeper who was rich, or whose parents were rich but had to work. Just one of those shows that as it went on, it just got crazier and crazier and crazier. And the show still, many people talk about this, probably the best finale, or certainly one of the best finales of a comedy ever.
I agree with you. Yeah.
So I mentioned the first sitcom. Essentially what happens in the finale is, and this is a big plot point in the 80s. It's such an 80s thing. A Japanese company buys the whole town in this, local bucolic Vermont town. Bob Newhart, he refuses to sell out. And so there's a reunion at the town a few years later, and everybody's there, and they're visiting the inn, and there's golf balls whizzing all around outside, and he gets hit in the head with a golf ball. And, he passes out, and he comes to, and he's in bed, and he's like, honey, I had the weirdest dream. He turns on the light, and it's his wife from the first show.
Yes.
And, they're going on and back and forth, and he's telling her about the dream, and, she's like, you shouldn't have had so much Chinese food. And he's like, oh, I also had a blonde wife, and, she turns the light back on, and, there's a lot of laughter. So, that show ran for 184 episodes. The other thing I'll add, too, is that some of the sharper humor in that show in the last season or two, it really set the table to me for the 90s and some of what you started to see in sitcoms. Like 80s sitcoms are generally nicer, more family-oriented, didn't cross a certain line. Seinfeld kind of crossed that line, and other shows started doing as a result. If you watch the last 2 seasons of Newhart, you can see the writers kind of playing with that, and it really set the table for that in a way that other shows from the 80s did not. So yeah, Newhart for me, just a great show, and I think it's kind of underrated because some people look at it as a goofy show, but if you really watch it and go back, there's more to it than that.
I agree with you. And speaking, a little bit of trivia for Larry and his brother Daryl and his other brother Daryl. So Larry was William Sanderson, and he was also in a couple movies, other movies from the 80s that I liked, small parts, but he had a small part in Blade Runner, and he also had a small part in Fletch. And then the other brother Daryl was John Volstead, who I remember. One of my favorite movies of the 80s was Stripes with Bill Murray, and he was Captain Stillman's aide, the guy who had to run out with the grenade and all that. But anyway, so just some other trivia of that show. Okay, so my number 2. Let's go back to the summer of 1992, shall we? And back in that summer, I went to the movies with my friends, and I saw a movie that I still love to this day. And it was a movie about this high school nerd that mixes some chemicals in a lab, and he ends up spilling them on himself, and he gets telekinetic powers. And being a teenager, of course, he uses his powers to do stuff like make girls' tops pop open, and, you know, being a teenager at the time, I loved that. And being as it was 1982, that kind of thing was completely acceptable. But anyway, the movie was zapped, and the two leads were played by Scott Baio and Willie Ames. And apparently they were so popular together, they ended up getting a sitcom together. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Charles in Charge. Ran from 84 to 85, and then it came back in syndication from 87 to 89. Went on the first run from 84 to 85. So Scott Baio plays this character, Charles. He lives in the basement of the Pembroke family. And in return for his room and board, he had to help raise their kids. And Willie Ames was like his dim-witted best friend. Maybe one of the worst acting performances in the history of television, too. It ranked right up there with the cast of Small Wonder. So Willie Ames, he was awful as Buddy Lembeck. But anyway, the show got canceled in 85. And then in 87, they decided that they'd bring it back in syndication. And what they did was they came with a new family, the Powells. Yeah. And that was a way better version of the show. Because
he came back to the house thinking he'd have a job. And they had moved.
Right.
Like purportedly he'd come back like a few months later. It wasn't just like, he came back the next day or whatever. So, yeah.
And then the Powells were there. So then, and the cast was like, it was like Nicole Eggert and Josie Davis. And I remember the grandpa, Walter Powell, he was really, really good too. And the mom was Sandra Kearns. And Willie Ames was still as as ever. But I really loved it. I loved that show. And
They kind of like started moving. Like one thing they did with Ames, I remember in the syndicated version, is they started making him like goofier and goofier.
Yes.
And basically, it just put him in a position where, like, eventually they kind of like edged. They didn't write him off the show, but they really just made him like a broad, like ridiculous, kind of like Joey on Friends. Just eventually made him into a ridiculous parody of what he was.
I agree with you. I got one other story about this show. When I first got married, I remember we moved into our new house and I hooked up the TV and everything, and then I turned it on, and we were still like unpacking in our house. We had just bought the house and moved in, and I put the TV on and TV Land was on, and they were running an episode of Charles in Charge, and I literally freaked out. And to this day, I still can't believe that my wife didn't divorce me on the spot. But she stuck with me. And you know what? I stuck with Charles in Charge ever since over the years. I love that show. It's my number 2. On to your number 1. What do you got, Mike?
Well, I have the, obvious one. And if you pick this, we can both talk about it for a while. I don't know how you do a list like this. If you're going mainstream like I am and not pick Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers is not only the like best sitcom of the 80s. I still maintain, and I know some Seinfeld fans would disagree, and Yancy, you mentioned Parks and Rec, and there's some people who think that show was the best ever. Cheers to me, well, put it this way, if you're just talking about best episodes of a show, perhaps Seinfeld fits the bill, or maybe even The Simpsons. But if you're talking about best episodes and consistency of a show that ran for over a decade, it's Cheers for me. Just some amazing writing. Again, you're talking about a cast, Ted Danson, Shelley Long, Woody Harrelson, who went on to fame in movies, Kelsey Grammer, who, went on with the same writers for most of the run to do Frasier. Just a hilarious show. Of all these shows I mentioned, Cheers is this kind of show that if I'm traveling and, I turn on the TV, if I'm on a business trip and Cheers is on, I have to watch Cheers. Like it's just one of those like shows that's so amazing. What's kind of funny about it is that at the beginning when it was pitched, NBC kind of had this feeling about it that was like, okay, like a show in a bar, like that doesn't seem like, it seems kind of dark for a comedy. It doesn't seem like something that would necessarily stick. On the first season, the ratings, they were okay, but they weren't necessarily like, top of the pops. And actually, in its first season, I had to kind of look it up. They were 74th out of 77 shows in ratings.
Yep, almost canceled that sucker. Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, and today a show like that would be canceled.
Yep.
Like you probably wouldn't. It probably made it through a season, or would have wound up, on Netflix or syndicated. But it basically they wound up getting some attention at the Emmys. I don't remember if they won or if they were nominated. And the president of the network, Brandon Tartikoff of NBC, really pushed that show along. And, eventually, this is kind of similar to Seinfeld, too, which started out like middling in the ratings. It built up an audience and people were, really excited about it. And, finally, Cheers became like a number one. Well, it wasn't quite number one because Cosby, which I mentioned, was essentially number one for a while. But, Cheers eventually was a number one show, and it just went on and on. And I would recommend, if you go out on the internet, there's an oral history of Cheers article, and all the actors kind of talk about it. And I think there's a quote at the beginning of that article from Amy Poehler of Parks and Rec, talking about the influence of that show. Cheers is not only a great show, it's a show that has influenced so many other television shows. So, for me, it's next to impossible, like, just not to pick a show that I probably have more love for Cheers than I have for any other TV show.
Funny enough, a little while ago, Yancy mentioned to me that he went back and was looking on Netflix for a show to watch, and he stumbled across Cheers. Yancy, do you want to share your experience as a millennial watching this show?
I want to hear this, yes.
I've watched, I think, 10 or 11 episodes. And like I mentioned with Chris, I know that the title character, I can't even remember her name or the actress, but I know that she gets replaced by Chris Alley, which I'm like dreading. And then everybody tells me that like I need to like hold on, like it's still, it's not as like catastrophic as you think. Cause like I've become completely endeared to her, and like the dynamic between her and like Ted Danson's character is just like amazing. And it was one of those things where like it does start out like super, super slow, but I don't know. It's just like it quickly becomes like this super, super charming show that like I just didn't expect it to be that in depth and there to be that much chemistry. But what were you going to say, Mike?
Well, I was just going to say, what's to me, there's so many amazing things about the show, but that aspect of it, and at the time, when Shelley Long left, a lot of people were like, okay, well, this show's been great, but it's pretty much, most of it is the romance between, Ted Danson and Shelley Long's characters. Kirstie Alley comes on, and they essentially changed the show. I mean, there was some romance or attempts at romance between Danson and Alley, but it became more truly an ensemble piece, and in some ways it became, at least as a comedy, it became better. Like, and how many shows can do that where, usually somebody leaves or, something happens and that's pretty much the end and it just kind of flounders. So,
not to mention when Nick Colasanto died, you thought, well, what's going to happen now? Like, Coach is dead. Like, sorry, Yancy, I guess if you don't know. Sorry. But when the actor died and then they had to write it into the show, you thought, well, what are they going to do now? And then they bring out Woody. And they just kept reinventing itself.
He might have been better too. I mean, no offense to Colastano, who was very good, but it just like every time something happened on that show, they like Frasier. Kelsey Grammer's character was another one. He was supposed to be a 12-episode guy. It was supposed to be a short guest spot, and he worked out. And they're like, all right, well, let's write him into the show. And John Ratzenberger, who played Cliff, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but he auditioned for the George Wendt part.
Yep, he auditioned for Norm. That's right.
And he auditioned for Norm, and they were like, "Well, we don't want to hire you." And he went to the writers. He said, "How about the other guy at the bar? Like one other guy. He's like, the guy who knows everything. He's kind of annoying. He's sitting there." And they're like, "All right, we'll try you out for a couple episodes. We'll see how it works." And of course, Cliff is another one. Just another beloved character on that show.
Yeah, exactly. And like you mentioned, Frasier sticking around. I'm so glad that he did, because when it brought in BB Newirth's character, another whole dynamic to the show, took place. And then, the show had a spin-off. It had the Tortellis, and I'm like, great pick. And I agree with you that it's that it's really close to the top. But unfortunately, it didn't make my number one. So my number one is what I believe to be one of the most underrated TV shows in history. As far as I'm concerned, I think if you asked critics, like other than where we saw Tonight with Mike, what are the greatest TV sitcoms of the '80s? Cheers, Cosby Show, Newhart. Those are the ones that are going to come up. For me, Family Ties. There was nothing better than watching Alex P. Keaton every week when I was a kid growing up watching this show. There was just something about the premise of that show that just strikes a chord with me. So, Yancy, if you're not aware of the show, I'm sure that you're pretty aware of the premise of it. But what it is, these two hippies, they grow up in the 60s. And they're like big time activists. They demonstrated in the 60s. They were in the Peace Corps. And then they get married. And then, of course, their oldest child turns out to be like a total conservative Republican who loves Richard Nixon. And so that, of course, lent itself to lots of dialogue and situations that I think were important at the time, that were worth discussing. And, I think both at the time, just in general, right? But the idea of sort of exploring politics in a family setting, it wasn't new. It had been done before. But the thing was, it usually, when they did it, it meant that the parents and the older generation were the conservatives. And the younger generation were the liberals. Like if you think of like All in the Family as an example of that, with Family Ties, they flipped that on its head. And I think it might have been one of the first times in history where a younger generation was more conservative than their parents. And it reflected that in the show, right? And obviously, coming out of the 60s, a baby boomer kind of thing, right? But it made for a great show. But I think a lot of the show's success had to do with that. And a lot of the show's success had to do with Michael J. Fox. Any other actor, I think, would have really struggled with keeping Alex likable, or maybe just played him too broadly. Or me just like a one-note conservative, and then just left it at that. But Michael J. Fox was brilliant in that show. And then you throw in Mallory, who is Justine Bateman, of course, Jason Bateman's sister. She was actually more famous than him for a while there, right? But her character, to me, she sort of represented the whole consumer-driven, me generation selfishness of the 80s, whereas her mother was a feminist. Mallory was like into makeup and clothes, and she was more traditional feminine, right? Really good show, and lots going on. And it's kind of like with this podcast, with the Gen X versus Millennials, the show was like about baby boomers versus Gen X, right? I love that show. Anyway, so there's our top 5 80s sitcoms. So are you guys ready now to have some
fun with Yancy?
Okay, here we go. Yancy, I figured we'll do something a little different this week because Mike and I kind of monopolized the conversation there. Really sorry. The subject matter, 80s sitcoms. Mm-hmm. So Yancy decided that he would dig up some tough trivia questions about 80s sitcoms and see if he could stump us this week. So you game to play along with this one, Mike? He's got to stump us both, so we'll see how he does.
Can try.
Yeah.
This first one, I'm going to describe a popular character from a 1980s TV show, and you have to tell me the character and the show.
Sure.
He is boorish, a tasteless advertising account executive who wears loud plaid suits, and he often has a belt that matches his white shoes.
It's Herb Tarlick from WKRP in Cincinnati.
Okay. My guess too.
Ding, ding, ding. All right. You guys suck so bad.
I might not have gotten the last name, but I would have said Herb from WKRP. So yeah.
Herbert R. Tarlick. So,
were you guys big MacGyver fans? Did you ever watch that show?
No, that's actually one I wasn't really into all that much.
I saw a couple, but yeah, that was more. My brother was more into the dramas than I was.
Right. I was more of a sitcom guy. Is this a MacGyver question? Because MacGyver wasn't a sitcom. I hate to break it to you.
All right. Well, this is a pretty easy question. Okay, so he is a top, secret agent. Can you guys name the progressive agency that he works for?
Oh, jeepers. I don't know.
For MacGyver, I think you're going to stump me on this.
Cause it was with the government.
Yeah, it was an acronym, but I don't remember what the acronym was.
It was the Phoenix Foundation.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, did you guys ever watch My Two Dads?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
I probably saw like a third of them, like maybe the first season. Yeah.
Can you name the two dads?
Like the actors?
The actors, you mean? Paul Reiser and Greg Evans?
I don't know if I can name the
actual characters. Yeah, the first names of the two dads in the show.
No, I know it was Paul Reiser and Greg Evigan. I don't know the characters.
Yeah, the same way. I could name Reiser and Evigan, but I could not name the dads.
All right, I'll give you half a point for that, but it was Joey and Michael.
Oh, okay.
All right, so MASH is obviously an American television series. It was developed by Larry Gelbart, and it follows a team of doctors and support staff stationed in the 4077 Mobile Army Surgical Hospital in South Korea.
Yeah.
The show's title sequence features an instrumental-only version of what song?
Suicide is Painless. It's from the original movie.
I thought this was like so obscure.
I'm more a fan. Honestly, this is kind of a state your unpopular opinion. I'm more a fan of the movie than the show.
I could go with you on that. The movie was outstanding.
The movie is much darker.
Yes, it is.
It wouldn't have worked for TV because on TV, with that kind of speaking of characters who aren't likable, people would have just been turned off by those characters week in, week out. But for 90 minutes, it worked.
They were able to bring some of it, like with some of the blood and stuff like that you saw. But you're right, like they couldn't go all the way with those characters.
Well, the first couple seasons were like that, but as the show went on, it kind of got lighter and almost had to because
more sitcom-y. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Right, I'm going to give you a description of the show. You just simply tell me what the show is. At the behest of a shadowy government organization, an enigmatic loner steals a supersonic military helicopter from its twisted creator and uses it to fight the bad guys around the world.
Blue Thunder?
Nope.
Or Airwolves. It was Airwolf.
There you go.
There were two helicopter shows for me.
Yeah, Blue Thunder was based on the movie, I remember. Not to rip you down on this one, Yancy, but I don't think we've had one sitcom in this bunch. Oh, maybe MASH.
Okay,
MASH.
well, let's Name the hospital from St. Elsewhere.
It's St. Elsewhere.
No, it's not.
No, that's not the hospital. I don't know. I know the show took place in Chicago, but I couldn't name the hospital.
Again, it wasn't a sitcom, so I didn't watch it.
You're killing us, Yancy, with these drama questions.
All right,
Drama shows from the 80s. That's what it is.
It was St. Eligius.
St.
Was the name of the hospital. Okay, last one. This show ran from October 1982 to April of 1987. The title character gets no respect as a private investigator, so she makes up a fictitious boss. The only problem is, dashing and mysterious as this person is, this random person assumes this boss's identity.
I know the
show. She created a fake boss.
I know the show. Is it Moonlighting? Moonlighting?
It is not.
Ooh.
Mikey.
No, I was to say it wasn't Moonlighting, because Moonlighting, she was still the boss, and they clashed. I honestly, you stumped me on this one too.
All right, you're gonna say it's not a sitcom. Remington Steele was the name of the show. And last one, very quickly.
Again, another drama, another Friday night drama.
I don't know. I'm
gonna go down to Florida and get in trouble for these. I think yes, it's so bad that I was down in Florida last August and didn't see him.
Oh no.
Yeah, I took offense to that too, by the way. But anyways, I'm just kidding. This is especially for you, Mike. Can you name the seemingly dim-witted court bailiff from the show Night Court? His full name.
Oh, I know.
Well, I don't know. I know it was Bull.
Shannon.
Bull Shannon. What was his? Do you know? For all the points, all the internet points, do you know what his real first name was?
I don't remember.
Oh. It was Nostradamus Bull Shannon.
Wow, got that.
Nostradamus. Okay. That's a good one. Nope.
Yeah.
It's better than Cosmo Kramer.
Yeah, that's for sure. That one always came through.
Sorry, guys. This is all I got, and I didn't get the sitcoms in like you did. Obviously, I was just looking at shows that
shows from the 80s. Yeah, there we go.
Pretty good,
60 Minutes. Who was on 60 Minutes? I'm just kidding. Yeah, it's all good. Anyway, listen, Mike, I want to say thanks a lot for joining us this week and talking about the 80s sitcoms for the most part. Anyway, I just want to remind everybody where they can find you online and what you got going on.
Well, it's Mike Gianella, all one word, Gianella, at Baseball Prospectus. Right now, we're doing our fantasy coverage. I know, Yancy, you're a subscriber and you're a popular user of the Bat Signal, which is our premium service where you can ask questions and we'll answer them privately away from Twitter eyes. It is a pay site, but if you do play fantasy baseball, we've got about 20 articles a week right now. We just wrapped up third base week. Next week we'll be doing shortstop. So if you're if you're into fantasy baseball at all, that's the way to go. And I actually contributed an article to a beer website. Speaking of pop culture, the beer website is being run by Enosaurus, who's formerly of Fangraphs.
Nice.
And the website's called October. So check it out. I mean, I've got my article up there, but there's a lot of good stuff up there. If you like beer and if you like really diving into beer, it's kind of an extension of what Eno was doing over at Beer Graphs, and it's just diving in even more.
Nice. And if you want to reach out to us, at Yancy Eaton or at C. McBrien on Twitter, or you can always shoot us an email, Chris or Yancy at popgoesyourworld.com. Once again, thanks for listening to Pop Goes Your World, the pop culture podcast for the generations.
Thank you for listening to the Pop Goes Your World podcast. Continue the conversation on Twitter at C. McBrien or at Yancy Eaton. Please consider leaving a review for the podcast on iTunes or wherever you download and listen to the show.